All right, everybody, let's keep moving through our discussion, our reflection on James. I think we got probably two more discussions in us before we get to the end of the letter of James and therefore the end of this little mini series, our Thought of the Day series here. So it's probably good. It feels about like the timing is good timing on this series, but could be a shorter discussion today. But how many times have I said that, right? And every time I find something to jabber about, and then it ends up being a 20-25 minute video. So we'll see. But let's see, we left off, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through chapter 4. So I'm going to pick up where we left off. James chapter 4, verse 13. And then we're probably going to head into the first, 5 or 6 verses of chapter 5 as well today. So let's talk about this. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it's sinful there. This one is honestly a weird paragraph, and on some levels quite convicting for me personally. So we start off here. Listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city. So on some level, there's an element. I think the part of this paragraph that I find so convicting for myself is I'm a deeply committed planner. So if you put me on the Myers-Briggs assessment, I come out as an overextended, a very unbalanced, overextended planner. One of my needs is to know what's happening. I am not spontaneous at all. I don't fly by the seat of my pants. And so and really honestly, I feel like the right phrase is I pride myself on being able to somewhat control my life. Now, that's not all bad. Obviously, there are parts of being a person of intention, being a planner, this idea that the Holy Spirit, for some reason, only works with spontaneous people. Like the Holy Spirit works in planning just as much as the Holy Spirit works in spontaneity. So I'm not just talking about the idea of planning in general, but there is a part of me that puts confidence, puts my trust. There's an appropriate place for that, but then an inappropriate trust in this idea that I know what the next few weeks of my life hold. I know what's on my calendar for the rest of the year. I know what my objectives are. I know what I'm going to be doing in 2 days. I know. And if anything, if COVID's taught us anything, it's that none of us knew what was going to happen. I can still remember being on a weekend Bema event, a speaking event in Seattle, the week that COVID was kind of making landfall in the States. And it was that next week, just 7, 8, 9 days later, that the virus kind of took off and went crazy in the Seattle area. And man, how life changed for the next year and a half. So James's point here is very apropos. Like, listen, you who say, I know what tomorrow holds. I know tomorrow we're going to go to this city or that city. We're going to do this or that. I know what's on the itinerary. I know. On some level, I feel like James is talking to me there. And James says, you don't know. Then there's this other element that seems to be driving and again, we've pointed this out kind of all through the book of James. On some level, part of what the fellowship that James is addressing here, this Jewish church, these 12 tribes kind of scattered around the world, part of what they were wrestling with was this pursuit of wealth on some level. It's very evident as you read through these chapters of James that part of what they're dealing with is wealth and poverty, the rich and poor, making money. This is driving some of their experience and some of the things that they're dealing with here. So I'll read this again. Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go into this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. So there's two elements to that. The planning element, this sense of I know what the future holds, and this sense of I am walking into the future intentionally because of how I'm going to profit from it. Well, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. And again, we've learned that in this last year and a half, 2 years. You have no idea what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist. And James works off of this biblical idea from, I would argue, even the wisdom literature, books like Ecclesiastes, and that Hebrew word for vanity is a word connected to mist. Isaiah talks about our lives being like a vapor. Our lives are a mist. Like, what is this? What is all this confidence that we put in our plans? What is all this confidence we put in our objectives and our goals and our intention? What is all this? Especially when it comes to just building up my own bank account, building up my own sense of security. James says, you don't know. That's not where security lies. You don't know what the future holds, and you don't know how secure you're going to be. You don't know where all these resources are going to come from. You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Now, I've heard people get really wound up about the words. Like, it's important that you never say this, and it's important that you say that. And I think it misses the greater point of what James is getting at. There is a posture in life that assumes that we know. There's a posture that I struggle with that assumes that I can plan everything. I can make everything happen. And then there's a posture that says, well, I don't know what God has in store. I don't know what tomorrow holds. I don't know what I'll be doing. Like, I have a plan. I have some objectives. I got a calendar. I have some intentions, and I'm going to live life intentionally. But at the end of the day, I don't know. I don't know where God's going to take me. And if there's anything that I've learned, it's that next year could look totally different than I thought it would. I don't know. If it's the Lord's will, we'll live and do this, that. And notice that phrase still has an element of planning. That phrase still has an element of intention. That phrase still has an element of unless God has something else for us, this is what we believe God is doing, and this is what we're going to. But instead of making me the sole captain of this ship, it makes me the steward of something that God is doing. It makes me a steward in a larger picture. A larger picture. Everybody's been trying to help me say that word differently. There's a larger picture of what God's doing in the world, and my posture. I'm either the one driving, I'm the sole captain, and everything else is just kind of or I'm actually a part of something else. I'm either up here, or I'm a part of something else. I'm down here. Is there something that God's doing in the world and I am a part of it and I'm stewarding the part that He gave me? Or is this just my world, my plan, my calendar? As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. James is speaking to me. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Which seems like a totally disconnected verse, doesn't it? Like all of that paragraph, making plans, all of that stuff. And then this last verse, if anyone then knows the good that they ought to do and doesn't do it, it's sin for them. Seems like whiplash. Like, where did that verse come from? What is James thinking that makes sense? And the grammar actually assumes, if anyone then, I'm reading the NIV, the new NIV here, if anyone, if anyone then knows the good. So this is almost like a therefore statement. Like everything James was just talking about apparently culminates in this idea. It's like James saying, so then, if anyone then. So all this about knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, having plans, having objectives, having my own arrogant schemes on how I'm going to, and, and then James says, so if anyone then knows what they ought to do. So apparently, in whatever James is doing here, the context that James is speaking into, apparently these arrogant schemes, these business plans, these objectives, these intentions, these calendars, whatever these things are, these arrogant schemes, as he calls it, these arrogant schemes is keeping us, apparently we would be using these arrogant schemes to get out of the things that we know we ought to do. Like there are these things we know that Jesus is inviting us into, these things that we know God is calling us to and beckoning us to. There's a path that we know God has asked us to walk, and yet we have these arrogant schemes that we use to be like, well, maybe next week. Well, maybe next year. Well, maybe when I'm done with my degree. Maybe when I get my business started. Maybe when and all of a sudden, whatever conviction I had back in verse 13, that conviction's only gotten more clear because that connection actually makes a lot of sense in my heart. All the way back in verse 13, I was convicted because I have plans. I know what I'm going to do. I know what my next year looks like. I know what's on my calendar. And yet, too often, that same calendar, those same plans, I have these self-centered schemes. And they keep me from doing the thing that I know God is saying, I need you to do this. I need you to be a part of this. I need you to go there. Well, the thing is, God, I have plans. I have plans, Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city and spend a year, when you know that there's something you ought to do. So then, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Now listen. So there's a second. So the last paragraph started, verse 13. Now listen, you who say, now chapter 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people. Like, these are two, like James is calling us to like pay attention. Now listen, all you people who think you have it all together, who have your calendars, you have your plans, you have your arrogant schemes. And now he connects it to that next, this connected idea for him about wealth. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, the moths have eaten your clothes, your gold and your silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Which seems like a really heavy paragraph. And like, okay, that must be talking about somebody else. And yet when we started this whole journey through James, we were making all of these unbelievable parallels to how relevant this conversation was to, if you go back to the very first video, consider it pure joy. If you keep going through James and you think about be slow to speak, quick to listen. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. To beware of the power of the tongue. We thought about things like the way that we engage in debates and the idolatry of things like politics. We talked about the way that we play favorites, the way we engage in social media, the way that we have like parties or tribes or groups of people that we create this us versus them. We get it. We're on the inside. They're on the outside. And all of this conversation like sounded like right at home. Like, I think for many of us, that conversation was convicting because in 21st century America and even elsewhere, according to some of you, that this conversation was like, yeah, yeah, James might have have just written it to us, let alone 2,000 years ago. This works for us. And so then chapter 3 of James, it dove into this conversation about how this faith that we have, we say we have, like we're so wordy, aren't we? Like one of James's points is that we love words, don't we? We love words. We have so many things to say. We've got words for days. We've got critique for our enemies. We've got religious, self-righteous words. And James says, the things that we say we believe, if we really believed in them, they would actually change us and transform us. They would actually make us into different people. And then James kind of, I don't know if he doubled down or he circled back around, but he came back to this idea of being slow to speak and quick to listen. He talks about two wisdoms. He says there's a worldly wisdom and there's a heavenly wisdom. There's a wisdom that comes from like conventional worldly wisdom. And then there's a wisdom that comes from above. And one is selfish and arrogant and it's full of selfish ambition, is what James said. And then there's wisdom from above. It's submissive, it's considerate, it's sincere, it's impartial. James keeps connecting these ideas to real faith changes the way that you deal with people. And so then we go into like James 4 and now into James 5, and there's this like condemnation of these things that I don't think we typically think very critically about, where these are things that are just like these are things that we incentivize typically in our culture. These are the things that we elevate, that we praise people for. I mean, generally speaking, the fact that I'm a planner, the fact that I'm structured as a leader, people typically like that. People typically, whatever. We typically look at people that have done well in the world and have wealth. We typically look at them with a certain level of social respect, the things they have been able to accomplish and the way that they've probably worked hard for all of that. And James just doesn't have any of that. James is not on that train. Whatever train James is on, it's going a different direction. And for James is like, do not deceive yourselves about these metrics that worldly wisdom brings you. That's just more selfish ambition. That's just more selfish ambition. James says, James told us it was about being sincere and impartial and considerate and generous. And so now James says, all of these plans, all of these objectives, I actually have a whole section of my library right back here. It's right here. It's all a bunch of like my business. Much of it is secular business, wisdom books. And you have all you've learned all these things from great business leaders, and you let this keep you from the thing that God has called you to. And the thing that God called you to is to treat people differently. That's what faith would, if you actually had real faith, it would produce that kind of a life. And so kind of like cranks, I feel like it's like James is getting cranked up, and now he kind of like overflows into this. And what has all this wealth gotten you? Like and trust me, there's a lot of books right behind me that I really do enjoy. They have some useful things to say. But if I plant my feet in this kind of like worldly wisdom, if that's my goal, if these become my objective, what is this? Like what does this get me? Like if those are my plans, if I'm like today or tomorrow we're going to go into this city or that city, or stay a year, or employ this strategy, or do this thing, and you somehow lose the plot of God, you somehow lose the thing that God is inviting you to do. You know what you ought to do, and yet you don't do it. What does all of that wealth, what does all of that success, what does all of that worldly success get you? James says nothing. Your silver and gold are corroded. Moths have eaten your clothes. Misery is coming to you. That corrosion, your very wealth is corroded, and that corrosion, it testifies against you. and it will eventually destroy you. It will eat your flesh like fire. That when you're not about the thing that God actually invited us to, when you don't actually have the faith that you say you have, it actually destroys you on some level. Because what it does is it leads to injustice. And so these same people that said, I have faith, these same people that said, I know God, apparently they have deprived their harvesters of their wages. Apparently they have felt like it's okay to mistreat others. This is what happens when faith isn't real, when faith is just words, when you play favorites, it's like, and we talk about on the podcast how James is a chiasm. There is a front half and a back half to this conversation. And now we're on the back half of this conversation, which is pointing back to the front half of James, which is saying you can't play favorites. You can't. And now he's saying because what happens is it produces this and this and this. And so what we have to have is faith that actually transforms us, which is what forms the center of that chiastic conversation. You have condemned and murdered the innocent, the one who was not opposing you. James says when you live this way, you make enemies that weren't even enemies. Like you take people that weren't even opposing you and they become your opposition. Some heavy thoughts from James today. I still think very relevant. I think maybe harder to hear. I think maybe James chapter 1 and 2 was very relevant, but maybe a little bit easier to hear. A little conceptual, a little bit, and this one gets right at the heart of things. This gets right to the way that the things that we value and what we think are, how we define success and wealth and money and resources, and James just points right at it. And he doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't try to make it soft or soften the edges and the corners. He just points at it and says, that's where faith makes a difference. And when all it is words and it's not really faith, this is what happens. People get exploited. Folks get abused. Oppression happens. So faith matters. And faith is seen in action, not just words. More great reflection from James. I suppose, again, we weren't that short of a conversation, but nobody's surprised by that by now. I think we got one more conversation. We'll wrap up James in our next video. Thanks for chatting today. I'll look forward to the next time.